Reverend Doctor Ray Aldred was invited to present at the Canadian National Gathering held in May of 2023. Ray was first ordained with the Christian and Missionary Alliance in Canada and is now ordained with the Anglican Church of Canada. He is status Cree from Swan River Band Treaty 8. Ray is also the Director of Indigenous Studies Program at the Vancouver School of Theology, whose mission is to partner with the Indigenous Church around theological education. Ray presented at a cross-cultural ministry gathering for the CRC in the year 2000, and we were delighted to hear his reflection in light of that previous address.
Again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you and offer a word of observation as you work through the implication of being a denomination in Canada founded by Europeans but trying to embrace an Indigenous foundation or shift onto an Indigenous foundation. I was reading John 17:11 through 19 Wednesday. It was the gospel and the lectionary, and I was encouraged. Jesus' high priestly prayer in verse 11, he says that they would be one, even Father as we are one. And that we are on this journey of reconciliation because of the overarching movement that the creator of the universe has for all of us, that we eventually come into unity that reflects the order of the cosmos that first came into existence. And moving from glory to glory, it's not easy, however, to embrace the spirituality of another people. In the spring of 2000, I was asked to attend a gathering of the Christian Reformed Church and a few other guests at King's College in Edmonton, Alberta. People were talking about how to embrace the spirituality of Indigenous people and remain Christian. In these conversations, it was purported that they were trying to embrace Indigenous culture or express Indigenous culture within the church, but it was not an easy conversation. This is a conversation that has been happening in many denominations. The conversation was about how to be Indigenous and Christian, which is sort of echoed, not quite in the book, but in the title by my friend Randy Woodley, Growing Up Mixed Blood Without Being Mixed Up. Emphasis on the mixed up part. The difficulty that I saw in those days was the mixed purposes that seemed to lie behind the transplanted Euro-Canadian church. Evangelicals with their strong Reformation ties wanted to continue to call Canadians to be the Christian nation they were called to be. This at first sight seems appropriate, except that it was also rooted in the desire to have dominion from sea to sea. This idea of dominion had been long ago corrupted in Christendom. And even though many came to this country fleeing religious oppression in another place, brought with them the same oppression, and it was only a matter of time before it worked its way out. The residential schools were in part the result of seeing Indigenous people, often already baptized Christian, not being Christian enough, or the right Christians, because they did not espouse particular empire values and thoughts. The mixed purpose of trying to build an institution, but having to sacrifice people in order to do that. We came together and there was much discussion. And what I remember is that on the final day, I shared that in the process of coming to a moment of reconciliation in then my denomination, the Christian and Missionary Alliance, with a board member, I shared that Larry Wilson and I, Larry Wilson is from Peguis, we were meeting with denomination officials of the Christian and Missionary Alliance. And a denominational official and a lawyer came. The lawyer was also a board member, but in those days it seemed where you talked about reconciliation, lawyers were involved because denominations were scared they were going to be held liable if they confessed any wrongdoing. So we met, and that was when we wanted to come together heart to heart. But I remember that we were sitting there talking because we'd met we had talked about this for a long time, and I remember at one point the denominational official said in frustration, "What do you want?" He might have said, "What do you people want?" Or at least that's how I heard it. But he wasn't trying to be mean, but he was being honest. And I remember Larry Wilson said, "We want your heart. That's all we've ever wanted." And I remember the denominational official responded honestly and not judgmentally, but we don't do that. He meant that as a denomination, we did not meet with one particular group, but we were going to try to come together heart to heart. It culminated with a meeting at Fort San. At one time, Fort San was a one-time tuberculosis sanatorium in the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan. And we had a moment of reconciliation that lasted at least 2 years in the denomination that I was part of. For 2 years, we put relationship as one of the primary goals. Right relationship became the goal, the measure, and the means of the gospel. Eventually, we shifted away from that, as denominations do. Part of it was we wanted to be a movement. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book Life Together, states, whenever you make your goal to be a movement or you aim to try to be community, you've lost it already. You've lost it already. Because what happens is you shift to thinking about people and relationships in a utilitarian way, as something to be used to get something else. And with us in Canada, with denominations, so often some shadow of a Christian empire somewhere. It's like having glanced in the mirror and seeing what we were like, we shifted, and going away forgetting what we were like. And we become hearers of the word, not doers. But when we met, and we can exchange, we were at the beginning of this 2-year focus on relationship, and that's when I met with the Christian Reformed Church. It was actually my first consulting job. That's what I thought about. They just asked me to come and listen to them. I thought it was a good gig. They were going to pay me money to just listen to them and at the end say something. That entrepreneurial thing just keeps coming out. Yeah, a good insulting job. That's good. So I told that story, and then I just remember that Ted Charles got up and said something. And he was Navajo, longtime Christian Reformed. And he just said, if what we described, maybe some of the things I described had happened 100 years ago, things would have been different. And then the then head of the Christian Reformed Church, Bert will remember who it was. He said some things. Peter Borgard. And he said some things, and there was gifts exchanged, and I thought they were becoming hearts exchanged. And I got to see that, and I thought it was cool. To meet on the level of heart continues to be what we need to be doing together. We need to exchange hearts, for this is where the gospel lives. This is where Jesus is found, not at the height of our religious system, but on the level of human suffering, on the level of the heart. So let's come away for a moment and talk about the feelings that are in our hearts. Inenamoan, the OG Cree word, it means the feelings we have in our heart. But it's hard. It's not something we like to do. The president of the seminary where I teach, the Vancouver School of Theology, asked me a few years ago, I remember it was in a faculty meeting. Would have been one of the last faculty meetings we had before COVID that was in person, before we all went online for a couple of years. And he said, what can the school do to help you in your research? And I remember thinking, I thought bigger. I thought, you see, because whenever I talk, non-Indigenous denominations, folks always ask me, so what should we do? Because that's the dominating question, because that's what for most of Canada, they draw their significance from what they do, and so they want to know what to do. And usually I just said, I don't know. I don't know what to do. I remember one time I was speaking someplace and someone said, I feel so guilty. What should I do? I said, I don't know. I could take an offering. That was not a good thing to say. They didn't appreciate it. I thought it was great. You'll feel better, I'll feel better. I don't know. So I came up with 3 things. One of them was to heal the land. Second one was the one I want to focus on, was develop emotional intelligence. Learn to speak from the heart. The third was to somehow contribute to the conversation in society, a vision of unity that does not devolve into a new sectarianism or some new imperialism. But the second one was to speak from the heart. I thought that it could do at least 2 things. One, it could help us to shed the Christendom hangover and begin to embrace our own humanity. Whatever we do, it is human. If I've learned anything in Indigenous ministry and from listening to Indigenous story and elders, is that we're human. And whatever we do will always be human. Another way to put it is to let go of our triumphalism, to embrace the theology of suffering. We could learn something from the Haudenosaunee and from what Adrian, my older brother, has taught me about I'm going to mess up the name, but at the edge of the clearing, at the edge of the woods. That relationship, the beginning of relationship and understanding, is compassion. Number 2, that it would begin to build into our lives the emotional resources to enter into the recovery of justice and unity. It seems to me that this is the Proverbs James expresses, that in the midst of suffering, we need to embrace our humble circumstances in hopes of gaining wisdom or understanding. Not so that we can escape this earthly prison, but that we understand how to live on our way to the resurrection. 1979, I had the born again experience. Everything I do in life takes me 2 tries. I was baptized in the United Church, and that didn't take, so then I had to be baptized again in the Christian Missionary Alliance when I was an adult. I've been ordained twice, once in the Christian Missionary Alliance and once in the Anglican Church. It took me 2 tries to get a doctorate. Everything takes me 2 tries. But in 1979, I had the born-again experience. It seemed to me that when I asked Jesus to put his Spirit in me, that something happened to me, which is a great message that the Pentecostal church always brings to folks, is that if the God of the universe comes into you, something should happen. Something should happen. I sensed the call to ministry almost right away, not wanting to be presumptuous, so I waited 9 years before Elaine and I sold our house, moved to Regina, Saskatchewan, because you gotta wait, because I'm an addict. Addicts are megalomaniacs. They always have these big ideas. They always have, when you're drinking, you always got 3 cars and 12 houses. And I just didn't want to do that anymore. So I waited 9 years. It takes me a while. It takes me a while to think through things. I told Adrian, you get the parts of the story, they come slowly over years. It takes you years, though, to finally put them together. So we moved to Regina, Saskatchewan, where I did my undergrad and master's degree, and I discovered that the lessons that I learned in the church, which in those days, the lessons you learned in the church was to not feel. And that helped me to be good at the technique of theology. In fact, to this day, I can play Sudoku with the best of them when it comes. That's not Sudoku, but Lonergan's Trinity. I studied Lonergan's Trinity. It sounds as obtuse as Lonergan's Trinity. But it's like Sudoku, you fill in all the little blanks and you got answers. It's kind of cool. I can still do that. After all, the lesson from modernity was to keep emotions in their proper place, to lean heavily into the rational mind to prove the faith. If you applied proper method, then your success was almost guaranteed. Even before this, while still in the church, even before I went to ministry, while still in the church in Grand Prairie, I discovered that I liked the Reformed faith or the Reformed thought. I remember in a Bible study reading from Ephesians 2:8, "For it is by grace you are saved, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works." And pushing an elder in the Bible study that I think it also means that the ability to actually have faith, that too is a gift from God. That too is a gift from God. And I was learning theology was all about the right answers. In those days, there was the way of discipleship, the train of discipleship developed by Bill Bright. The Christian life was fact first, then faith, and then feelings. Feelings were those things that were kind of like the weather. They changed every day and you had no way of controlling them. So theology ministry was all about learning proper method, proper strategies, proper technique that would make you more effective in carrying out ministry. My Christian faith became a religion of the mind. Pain and suffering were a result of sin, and with an Augustinian moral universe, the solution to all problems was to deal with sin. It also meant there were no innocent victims. People suffered because of their choices. It was a result of sin. And that was the message that I internalized. The modern solution, as John Ralston Saul wrote in his book, Voltaire's Bastards, the solution to every problem is to think better. But I was entering into a ministry that meant all the answers that the institutional church was giving for the plight of Indigenous people was not working. That what if thinking better was not all that was involved? I went off to study and found myself studying for ministry, and I was good at studies, but in the Indigenous church, I was forced to reimagine how ministry and life was approached. And I came to understand that there was something seriously wrong inside the church. The church had mixed the spirituality of empire with the gospel of Christ, and as a result, as Leslie Newbigin points out in Foolishness to the Greeks, every place where the Western church was claiming to be the kingdom of God come to earth had instead succeeded for Indigenous people in bringing hell up instead. Moving to study and entering into ministry, I came to understand that there was something wrong. When I grew up, I experienced, if not racism, prejudice, because brown people experience prejudice. But as a kid in the system, you believed that it was normal. You begin to internalize the 5 lies that Canadian society and the church told Indigenous people. You are not good. You are not good enough or confident. You don't belong. You are unlovable. You shouldn't exist. And you internalize those lies. Maybe not everybody, but I did. You internalize those lies, and you believe those lies, and you begin to develop shame and guilt for being Indigenous. You know that you feel pain, and you learn to medicate your pain with food, sports, drugs, alcohol, work, and a myriad of other things, all aimed at making you feel better about themselves. But there is this growing sense that something is seriously wrong with the church. In the church, however, any discontent was blamed on individuals who had not learned to live the victorious Christian life. The solution was following John A. Macdonald's lead, first Prime Minister of Canada, that when it came to Indigenous people, what needed was better moral training. Or, in some, to have a deeper religious experience. So we labeled Indigenous people an unreached people group. The idea that we were unreached made it easier to explain why we were in so much pain and why our communities were not always doing as well as the rest of Canadian society. It also allowed the Canadian society and the church to see the racial tension in Canada as the fault of unbelievers. The solution then is to get people to fall in line with Canadian or church culture. If people would receive the European Jesus, then they would have lots of money, lots of friends, and all their sicknesses and disease would be cured. Even though most Indigenous people were open to some kind of relationship with the church and with Christ, they were labeled not Christian enough, a moral problem, in need of better worship practices. It amounts to an ongoing gaslighting of Indigenous people by blaming them for their problems. In the holiness churches, the focus became on dealing thoroughly with sin, which seems like a good idea, except holiness was defined as being separate from the world. And there were those who were in and those who were out, and the ones that were in were the ones that talked and believed like me, and the ones that were out were the ones that were not part of my group. Holiness replaced reconciliation as the metaphor for salvation. The subtle shift meant that victims of oppression and marginalizations were regulated to the sinful, helpless category or the sinful, arrogant category. Either way, the focus was not about coming together, but about protecting what was already there. The emphasis on salvation eclipsed the work of the creative God to bring all things into unity or harmony. Faith becomes something primarily in the mind, and as thinking beings, the mind and soul are broken free from the body and the earth so that we are just marking time until the second coming. The focus on the second coming and the transient nature of this life yield either licentiousness, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, or a stoic approach to life that produces churches full of curmudgeons, which my grandchildren think I'm already there. I realized that something's wrong. Part of it was because I watched a video about Noam Chomsky. It's called Manufacturing Consent, Mind Control in a Democratic Society. And I realized in the church, that's what we do. I realized the institutional church, we manipulate or spin the narrative to make it seem like everything was okay. The fault for failing ministry, failing being defined by poor numbers, was blamed on people either not having proper method or technique or for being hard-hearted or resistant. I knew that something was wrong. But I remember it was for training for ministry that the positive side of thinking deeply and looking at things in all their complexity, that was still there. And it helped me thinking through what was going on. That the gospel had been put, and one of the things we discovered was that what was happening all over the world was the gospel was put into the heart language of people. It wasn't happening in Canada. And so we began to think, how do we put this into the heart language of people? And part of it is I had to learn to feel. When I started in Indigenous ministry, when we started off thinking about self-determination and holding together Indigenous and non-Indigenous, even the way you say that, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, it was from a negative perspective. Not everyone. Adrian Jacobs represented a group that were positive about Indigenous identity. I remember Adrian said that. He said, I thought there was two categories of people in Canada, he said. Haudenosaunee and everybody who wanted to be Haudenosaunee. But for lots of us, I think for many of us, because we had grown up in non-Indigenous world of settler culture or modernity or Western culture, whatever word you want to use, that we knew that we did not fit in whatever we were. But whatever we were, we knew it wasn't white. That's what we knew. Some of us adopted different words to describe what we were. We were no longer Christians. We were followers of the Jesus way. But even in doing that, we fell into the trap of thinking we could change our reality by using different words to define ourselves. This might be helpful for getting one to think through things, except it still falls within the general language game of modern technique that seeks to name things and thinks if it can describe a situation, you have control over the situation. Try telling your partner that you can explain why they're angry. See if it makes them less angry. See if it helps you control the situation. Playing the change the words game can be a way to avoid talking about the hard things. I found that this didn't help me to think through the complexity of the issue that we were facing. Changing the words, maybe tearing down statues, renaming streets could be the right thing to do, but it could also just placate our emotions and make us believe we have changed something when all we have done is done some rebellion that is actually allowed within the technique of efficiency of modernity. We have just said something old was new, repackaged something, and thought by doing so we had actually changed the world. That is what I think that's what they meant by rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. We had actually shifted things. We had not actually shifted things. But we have at least understood something was wrong. That is the way we were coming into this whole issue of identity was wrapped up in our world. We could not think our way out of this, although thinking remains important. What was needed was to shift our thinking and way of being, to embrace our own pain, to try and rely upon our humanity as being made in the image of God, and that there were resources available to us that we had deemed of no value, that were of great value. For me, it was a shift from a spirituality of technique to a spirituality of the real world, a shift from proposition to a world of story, from a divided world of material and spiritual to a real world where the spiritual and material intertwine and touch one another. It meant for me to shift from doing Indigenous ministry from a deficit position to seeing it was as the greatest resource that I had ever encountered. Key to the whole thing was to be able to listen to my heart as a way to understand the world that was going on around me. It was a shift from thinking to not thinking. It wasn't a shift from thinking to not thinking like some kind of meditation. It was trying to see things from another person's perspective. And this was only accomplished by listening to the heart and being willing to feel. But I had to learn how to do that. It started for me by listening to people in the church who told their story. It's true that you could go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's website and listen to people's stories, but if you listened, survivors of the residential schools and survivors of Indigenous day schools and survivors of the 60s scoop were telling their story. They were always telling their story. And I heard the stories over coffee and in the church. I remember this one Indigenous elder would just tell me a story, but he would also listen to me. Sometimes he had this amazing ability to listen and know exactly what was going on in my life. And he would just tell me about my life after he listened to me go on for a couple hours. It was always insightful. Indigenous ministry was not easy, so to make ends meet, I started doing all kinds of things. I went back to school to do a master's degree because the denomination didn't pay enough to actually put food on the table. So I got a little bit from the denomination for doing that. I was a full-time student. I was overseeing 9 churches for the denomination, which kicked in a little more money. I was running on adrenaline. My feelings were shut down. 1998, my wife said to me, as I was contemplating signing up for another year of this, she said, you can keep going, as she always did, as a dutiful, supportive spouse. She said, but I'm going to die. I called up my friend who'd offered a chance to go to marriage encounter a couple of days before, and I told him I was too busy, and I said, can we go? And they said, yeah. So we went, and we learned to listen. But I remember at the marriage encounter, my wife says to me, the first night, I'm not supposed to tell you what goes on, it's all secretive, but I'm too old to care. And the first night, you know, you were supposed to write letters to each other. And so we wrote a letter, and you're supposed to tell everything that you liked about the person when you first got to know them. My wife had all these things that she wrote them. And then right at the end of the letter, she said, but to be honest, I don't like much about you anymore. And so for the next 2 hours, I tried to convince her that she really didn't believe that she just didn't understand. But as I was writing this, talking to you, I thought, in one sense, it was what the church does to people who are hurting. They try to explain to them that it's really their fault, that they don't understand. They're just not looking at it in the right way. Somewhere after midnight, I think it was after midnight because they take your watch away at marriage encounters. It might have been just 15 minutes, I don't know. It seemed like after midnight. I realized I don't like much about myself anymore either. And I began to learn to feel, to share heart. And it continued. One of the things we realized, Elaine and I realized, is what a marriage encounter does, it gets you back so that you're in love again. You feel like, you know, that honeymoon thing. But you got to do something different. You got to go to counseling or something, or you're going to end up in the same place. You can't keep doing the same shit over and over again. Isn't that how that saying goes? and hope for a different result. You got to do something different. But we realized that there was all this other stuff that was going on inside. So we went to Survivors of Abuse leadership training. It was about learning to lead a support group for people who'd suffered abuse or extreme disappointment. And there we learned to tell our story and to listen to stories. And I began to understand that there was something that Indigenous people had because of all that had happened to us. That we had this connection, that we had not forgot about how to feel. Many of us had shut down, but they were still there and began to feel. It was not easy to listen to the voice of emotions. This is particularly true for a young man who is strong. And now that I'm an old man who is weak, I'm still not sure it's easy. But I think I've come to understand that some things, because I had teachers, that you have to feel. And you have to learn to listen. When I was 50 some years old, I remember there were these 4 prominent women in my life. My wife, my doctor, my cognitive therapist, and the author of the book, The Language of Emotions. And they all said, your feelings are not trying to hurt you. They're trying to help you if you just listen to what they're saying. And so I tried to, at 50, my whole life, until I was 50 some years old, my whole life, I thought the solution to difficult feelings was to not feel. But I'm learning to feel them. And it made all the difference for ministry. We have to find a shared plan. I'm running overtime, I know that. But I'm sorry. I'm not really sorry, I'm old, I don't care. We want your heart, that's all we ever wanted. We want your heart, that's all we ever wanted. The heart is the center of who you are. In Hebrew thought, the heart is the center of who you are. That's the real you. Daniel Goldman's classic, Emotional Intelligence, says something to the effect, thinking conviction is never as strong as emotional conviction. What is needed is to come together heart to heart, and I think it involves at least 3 things, or at least I put it, you got to come up with some way to put things. So here's 3 things. You got to do this, otherwise people pay you money and they think they didn't get anything. So here's 3 things you can write down. Tell the truth. What I learned on my journey is that things change when you tell the truth. When Indigenous people began to tell the truth by filing lawsuits against the government and church, and then when the church had the church had to begin to tell the truth. The United Church, the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Pentecostal Church, the Pope eventually, all began to confess and apologize for what had happened. When we met as the Christian and Missionary Alliance Board and the First Nations Alliance Church of Canada, I said, look, if the pain that I feel in my heart is just me because I don't know how to handle it, then you will not hear another word about it. I won't complain about it. But the truth is, if I want to know, has society's attitudes towards Indigenous people impacted how you have treated us as Indigenous people in Indigenous churches? And the board of directors said, yes, it has. Yes, it has. And we exchanged hearts. Indigenous people began to tell the stories of abuse and pain that they had suffered. And in 1998, the Canadian government, via the Indian and Northern Affairs Minister, Jane Stewart, issued a statement of reconciliation. They apologized, or sort of apologized. They acknowledged that something was wrong and they began to tell the truth. 2008, Stephen Harper offers an apology and begins to tell the truth. The truth continues to be told and it produces emotion. In Inanamon, you learn to tell your story. You learn to visit the pain in the midst of your soul, not so that you can wallow in the pain or remain a victim, but you tell your story to show how to go where many who have suffered trauma and are afraid to go, they realize watching you as you tell your story that they could go there too. And as you tell your story, people find courage to tell their story. The narrative turn of the Bible, the narrative turn of the gospel, helped me to understand the gospel is story, with its central proposition that Jesus is Lord. But it is a story because the truth of the Creator is too big to be held in a set of eternal principles, propositions, statutes, laws, or institutes. I thought you guys, the Christian Reform, would like that. You want to exchange hearts. If you want to exchange hearts, you'll have to learn how to tell the truth and tell your story. But before you tell your story, you have to learn to listen. To heal, you have to tell your story. You tell your stories so that your relatives can heal. In a book called Night Spirits, which is about the relocation of the Siesi Dene, the Dene author writes, "My story is a gift. We must tell our stories so that you can listen." Indigenous people took the government and churches to court. They told the truth. And out of the residential school settlement, they asked that the national TRC be established where people came, they told their stories. This was happening already if people were listening. As I said before, they told stories and you could hear them. The survivors of the residential school, the Indian day schools, tell the truth. They offer you a gift. They give you the opportunity to hear how much pain and sorrow Canada caused. This is a gift because if you do not learn how to listen and feel the pain that you have caused, then you cannot be transformed. That's why your partner gives you a gift when they tell you how much your actions hurt them. Because unless you will feel, you will not have the emotional resources to change. But it's not easy, so you have to learn to listen. Have you ever wondered why the Spirit is giving to grieving apostles and followers of Jesus who were huddled in the upper room? Why Jesus chooses the night before he is going to be handed over and killed? After he has told them that he's going away, in the midst of their grief, he tells them that he will not leave them alone, but will send a paraclete, an advocate. The Spirit comes in a variety of settings, but it seems to me in the beginning and in my life, the Spirit comes when people get together and tell the truth. Full disclosure, and they listen. They listen and feel the pain, and they feel empathy. What we need is not sympathy, but empathy, Brene Brown says. This is not about guilt and shame to stop people from doing anything, but about gaining the emotional energy necessary to change. Unless you're willing to listen and feel, you won't do anything. To exchange hearts and you have to put emotions first. You have to begin your teaching on the heart level. all of your programs need to begin on the level of emotion, on the level of the heart, because that's where people actually come together. Number 3, you have to have a shared plan. This is where we are today. We're continuing to tell the truth. The ground penetrating radar is being done at the site of former residential schools, and those children in unmarked graves continue to tell the truth. There continues to be the opportunity to listen. The Vancouver School of Theology, Indigenous Studies Program, and other Indigenous Studies programs provide an opportunity to listen to Indigenous professors and Indigenous students. There are powwows. There's Hobier on the West Coast, the Niska New Year. There are other opportunities to hear the voice of Indigenous people, but we need to come heart to heart and come up with a plan. To come heart to heart, we have to shift away from thinking about holiness and salvation and understand that holiness or wholeness and salvation is about finishing the creative work of God. Irenaeus pointed out, and as many of our Indigenous creation stories do as well, that creation was made perfect but immature. Human beings were perfect but immature, and sin bent every relationship, but Jesus Christ has come to set things back on the path of creation. Reconciliation is coming together of all things. The Creator and creation would meet in perfect harmony that we see in the person of Jesus Christ, fully God, fully human, creation, creator, in perfect harmony. And this is the goal, the purpose of creation, to see all things reconciled. And when we come to Christ, we join the Creator in the ongoing work of bringing all things together in harmony. On the last day of Inanamon, we come, we celebrate. Celebration or ecstasy is the ability to, in the moment, despite of all the things that are going on, you celebrate the fact that it's a good world. It's a good world. And we do a round dance. And then I think it's the tea dance in the north. Traditionally, I can't remember if it's the right hand or the left hand. My wife tells me I don't know the difference anyways. But you take that which is most precious and you put it in your hand and you give it to the person dancing behind you as you're reaching forward and taking the thing that's most precious to them. And at the Inanamon, we say it's our heart. We're exchanging hearts. But there are challenges to the journey. When I came to faith, I remember the burden of guilt and shame, that it was lifted off of me. This is the message of the cross, that no matter what I've done and no matter how great my sin, there was forgiveness and freedom from the punishment that was leveled against me. But we have made it not enough. It seems we must dig up the bones of those who have done atrocities and rehearse the crimes they committed and cry out for some relief. Here's the difference, perhaps. It's that Indigenous people cry for relief from the pain of exploitation, from generational trauma, and from the pain that continues to gnaw at the inside. Cry for relief for the pain that continues to gnaw at the inside and tells me that I'm not good enough. And now I will never be good enough. The pain that makes it difficult, if not impossible, to come back together, as Thomas King in his words, 1,000 porcupines crying in the dark. We're too prickly and scared to come back together. Our best intentions are met with unbelief and words of suspicion, as we do not fit in any place, not pure enough to be part of mainstream society. Our minds and hearts are racked with images and memories too horrific to be part of the pure modern church that sits on display in its waxy cold claws, slowly fading from existence. Too modern or filled with foreign people's words and ideas to ever be able to walk the earth in innocence and nakedness. Forever marked as a lover of settlers, a friend of transgressors. So we are subject to a slow retreat from relevance, from powerful angle, from significance. We're the most pitiful of all, for we have forgotten our mother's or our grandfather's tongue, and we will never get it back. All there is left is the feelings that I have in the depth of my soul. So I offer that to you. The feelings I have in my heart, I put them on my sleeve, and I hold them out to you. as we continue on this journey of reconciliation we have to feel. Thank you.